Now we'll discuss, of course, the most famous pyramids, right? The pyramids of Giza, or the Great Pyramids, as they're often called. And these are located in Cairo, and again are indicative of sort of the pinnacle, right, of pyramid building. Now, interesting fact, pyramids are the most well-known or recognized Egyptian monuments, but really have a very small window when they were architecturally created, really starting with the step pyramid, and then a little bit past the pyramids of Giza is the time of the pyramids. So a little bit into the Middle Kingdom period. There's reasons we think for abandoning pyramids, and of course, I'll tell you a little bit about those reasons later on when we get to the Middle Kingdom. But it is interesting to note that it is what people know as Egyptian in a sense, but again, isn't actually that long lived as an architectural type. The pyramids of Giza are related to three pharaohs: Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, or you'll see Menkaura if you're looking at the slide. Now, an important note about Egyptian translation of names into English: by looking at Menkaura, you'll notice I called it Menkaure with an E on the end. Here it's written Menkaura with an A on the end. Either is considered appropriate, right? Either is considered acceptable because Egyptians didn't have vowels in their system of language in a sense. Like we have to kind of make up the vowels and insert the vowels to make the words make some kind of sense. So sometimes you'll see, for instance, Ra written as Ray, R-A or R-E. Neither one is right or not right. It's just playing with the vowels essentially. So again, Menkara, Menkare, it doesn't really matter. It's how we're trying to translate that pictographic, phonographic language into English, right? So we can speak about it. So if you see kind of deviations in names or spellings, just roll with it. It's not really a big deal and choose the one that you feel most comfortable with. Unless for some reason you see scholarship that says it's this particular spelling, please use it, right? But again, the three pharaohs here are Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Khufu is the grandfather because he is the father of Khafre and the grandfather of Menkaure. And Khafre, of course, is the son of Khufu and the father of Menkaure. And Menkaure is the son of Khafre, the grandson of Khufu. Notice we talked about family line. That's going to be very important to how you are selected to rule or you're selected to lead. So notice that each son then becomes the next pharaoh and would have been married to his sister or half sister, etc., and so forth. So we already talked a bit about family lines and how that comes into play. Now, what are the Great Pyramids? They are the burial places of these pharaohs. That's the traditional reading. If you want to go out and find a lot of alternate theories, there's plenty of stuff out there. Some of it very intriguing, like, what does that mean? And then some of it just pure crap. So you have to be very careful, of course, when looking at your sources. But there's some alternate theories that people talk about that are of interest. Were the pyramids aligned with the stars in Orion's belt? Hence their very specific placements. And why? If they are, why? Some people wonder, are these really burials? Because if you look inside the pyramids, all the usual trappings of burials aren't there. There's no inscription with like the pharaoh's names. There's no tomb paintings. It's a very odd situation. It's a little too much for us to go into, but I put it out there in case you want to go look into some of this research or some of these theories because it is really fascinating to consider that maybe this is not what we think, or again, there's more to it than we know. I will say that even when you consider them as burials, they're very unusual for the idea of burials. You'll notice that each complex, as we'd say, so Khufu has a complex, Khafre has a complex, Menkaure has a complex. Each complex has a pyramid, then it has a mortuary temple, has a causeway that leads down to a valley temple. The temples, of course, were used for various offerings. The valley temple would be where the public would come to, the mortuary temple would be your family, and of course, the pyramid would be your burial. Notice that around the pyramids, especially around Khufu's pyramid, are what we call the mastaba fields. This is where lower people within their reigns were buried. You'll note also that in front of Khufu's pyramid and then Menkaure's pyramid, very prominently, are the pyramids of the queens. So, who were the lead queens essentially within their families? Remember, the queens were usually also their sisters. So, do celebration given to these people within their family line. So this is the layout, right? You'll notice that Khufu's is the biggest, Khafre is next biggest, Menkaure is the smallest. And we think this was because when Khufu started pyramid building, the height of prosperity in Egypt was at its apex. There was a lot of resources. As you kind of move down towards Menkaure's reign, the Old Kingdom started to have some problems, right? They started to have some issues with famine, which again, right after Menkaure's reign, led to the dissolution of the Old Kingdom entirely. So the sizing we think was maybe to show honor to the grandfather, but also maybe was aligned with economic problems, right, of the time. Now, how were they built? We don't have a lot of information on this. So I always joke that just because there was writing doesn't mean they were writing certain things down. So we don't really know. We don't really know how the step pyramid system began. We don't know how the bent pyramids, why they went to that, and we don't know how they got to the true pyramids in a sense. It's all sort of guesswork. But one theory that the bent pyramids I think help support is that a core of structure was built, and then dirt was mounded around the core, and then they would use the dirt as kind of these ramps to bring up the new pieces of quarried limestone to put into place to finish off the true pyramid. Yeah, again, it's a good as a theory as another. Knows that they're using a log sled method here, which definitely uses human capital as your driver. Now, to be very clear, this is not slave labor. So that's one of those misconceptions that keeps being thrown around in the world of Egyptology. I mean, I've had students like try to argue with me, like, I know it was slaves, I read something somewhere, and I'm like, well, that's nice, but it's wrong. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there's plenty of research, done primarily through the British Museum and through Zahid Hawass, who is considered like, the primary Egyptologist, that this is not slave labor. It was done by common Egyptians, either as a way to have a job, probably, or a way to pay your taxes, let us say. And I say taxes where I'm making air quotes right now because they didn't have money. This was a barter system economy, but you would show your allegiance, let's say, to the pharaoh and also to the gods through your work. So when I say taxes, they're showing their alliance or their allegiance, right, to their rulers, to their gods, by going down and working on the pyramids for a day or two, even if you were considered higher in the hierarchy. Again, most common Egyptians, though, this would have been a job. They've done excavations at the pyramid site that show a widespread beer breweries and bread bakeries. Try saying it really fast 5 times. Beer, breweries, bread, bakeries, right? Lots of bees. The beer was a way of hydrating, and the bread was their meal. So we think this is how they either paid the people or how they, again, provided their lunch break in a sense when they were working down at the pyramids. So we know there was a lot of people here. They were being fed. So the slave theory, no, the slaves are not building the pyramids. That is completely inaccurate. And if you look at the biblical overlay of like the slaves in Egypt, they actually were present. The Jews are in Egypt in the New Kingdom time period. So long, long past the time of pyramids. But again, with storytelling, often you collapse certain ideas together in order to make the narrative more compelling. So we think maybe this is what happened with biblical narrative, right? Is that the pyramids are a noteworthy symbol, so have the slaves build the pyramids, right? But again, the Jews were present in Egypt in the New Kingdom period, not in the Old Kingdom period. So the slave theory, nope, nope, get rid of that. We're going to just go through and look at some of the highlights of the pyramids. And by the way, for a test, I really treat the pyramids like a complex. I treat them as the 3 pyramids together when I talk about them in a testing right situation, because I think that's just easier than looking at individual pyramids. They kind of all look the same. But there are some differences between them. The Great Pyramid, as I mentioned, is the largest pyramid. So it is the most significant, right, of the 3 in size. I like the image on the right because you get a sense of scale of the limestone blocks. The limestone blocks were quarried across the Nile in the land of the living and then had to be brought across the Nile to the land of the dead. So it was very labor intensive. And you notice they're very big blocks of limestone that had to be used to construct the pyramid. So a lot of labor intensity here. As I mentioned, you can't really have people build something like this in a time when things aren't great. So we know the early part of the Old Kingdom was very prosperous. simply because of what you see produced as far as architecture is concerned. You had to have a very stable economy, you had to have a very loyal people to build something like this and to undergo the physicality that was necessary to make this happen. This is a diagram of Khufu's pyramid. And as I'd mentioned, one of the reasons why people sometimes go, are they burials? Is because the layout seems very strange. There was no underground burial like you saw in the mastaba, but yet there was not really any grave goods or tomb carvings or paintings. It's just a very, very strange layout. So I, in our limited time, can't go into all the theories about what the heck is going on here. So again, if you're very interested in the pyramids, definitely do your research because there's a lot of different things about like what exactly is going on here. Why are certain things aligned, this air shaft aligned the way it is to a certain star in the sky at a certain time of the year? And again, are we really seeing everything that we need to see, when we look at this complex, when we talk about it? One thing I will always say about the pyramids though is that they are fascinatingly complex for the level of society that we're dealing with here, with no computers, right? No way to like design things in a theoretical realm. They had to do things just by building them. For instance, if you look at the alignment of the pyramids, they're actually aligned perfectly to true north, true south, true east, true west. They're not even off by any deviation of any kind. Now, how you do that again before computers, and modern compasses and such, it really leaves people going, "Wow, what is this?" I mentioned that Khufu took his solar boat with him into the afterlife. So here you see his solar boat, which was buried next to the pyramid, which would have helped to make the transition from the land of the living, right, to the land of the dead. This is the pyramid of Khafre, the second largest. And don't make the mistake of thinking it's the biggest, because if you look at certain pictures, it looks bigger. It is not. It's just the angle. And here at Khafre's pyramid, you can note the original limestone facing, as we put it. The original pyramids had this polished limestone veneer or facing placed onto the outside layer, meant to look probably very shiny. We assume that these burials were meant to honor Ra, the sun god, and be aligned with the idea of the sun and Ra and, the worship of the sun. Just like the step pyramid was probably like a little staircase, right, going up to the gods, essentially, for the pharaoh to climb. So originally they were faced with this very shiny, smooth limestone. Where did the facing go? It actually was plundered by Egyptians in the 1800s to build modern day Cairo. So we're often not very good to our own heritage or history, unfortunately. So the people who built Cairo, modern Cairo, they just were like, "Ooh, pretty shiny, polished limestone. We'll just go over and take that and build our city from it." Khafre's pyramid is the only pyramid with any of the facing or veneering left. The rest of them have been stripped clean. So this very jagged, rough texture we see now, that wasn't the intended look of the pyramids originally. So we're seeing them right after the veneering has been replaced. I had mentioned that all the pyramids have two temples, the mortuary temple and the valley temple, with the causeway linking. And that then at Khafre's necropolis, you have the famous Sphinx, which sat down next to the valley temple. Now, what is the Sphinx? We assume it was a protective guardian for Khafre's tomb complex. We assume that the head is meant to represent him, the pharaoh, because it had to be carved, right, to look like him. Now, as I mentioned, there's always these alternate theories. So some people suggest maybe it's not Khafre that the Sphinx is supposed to represent. Maybe the Sphinx is far older than this complex. Again, you can go down that rabbit hole if you like. But the most simplistic reading we have of it is that it's meant to be a protective device, protecting the pharaoh's tomb complex. Just like the most Egyptian tombs, this was looted. Just so you know, Egyptian tombs were looted 99% of the time. So this is why we have a hard time actually gathering grave goods and gathering information, because not a lot of stuff is usually left. About 99% of Egyptian tombs are looted. So the Sphinx, good try, but not really gonna end up working out probably at the end of the day. Um, and you'll note it has a cat body, it's like a lion-like body, and then the head of a human. So once again, we wonder if this was a way of trying to use hybrids in a way of honoring animals, but not completely moving away from them at the same time. We also have the Ka statue of Khafre. The tomb itself, as we mentioned, was looted, nothing there. But in the Valley Temple, we find the Ka statue. Now, this is also why people were like, are these burials? Because the Ka statue was in the Valley Temple. Why would it be there? It's just sort of very strange and unusual. Because, again, it just doesn't seem to make sense with the original way that tombs were constructed. But we're happy that we have this. This is a life-size piece, so it's meant to represent, the spirit of Khafre. And there's a few things I wanted to note here. First off, I wanted to stress again the rigidity of the pose. I had mentioned numerous times already the canon of proportions, and I'll show you a slide here in a second with the canon on it. And I'd mentioned that the canon is the way that the bodies were shown. Canon with one N, it's like a set of rules, right? Canon with two N's is like boom, right? So canon with a one N is rules. So the Egyptians had very specific rules about the body and how to show the body. They always used this sort of rigid, static, very, stiff structure in order to show power, show control. You'll also note his hands. One hand is a fist and one hand is flat. And we think this is a way of showing duality in leadership or the balance of leadership. That you want to be benevolent to your people, you want to be good to them, hence the flat palm, which could pet you, and say, "Oh, that's a good little, constituent. Thank you for being such good and faithful followers," right? But often you have to give people the fist. The whole idea of like, is it better to be loved or feared? The Machiavellian question. Machiavelli said it's always better to be feared because when people fear you, they do what you want. Um, when people love you, they tend to try to take advantage of you because they're like, "Oh, I have a relationship with you. I can wheedle my way in." So Machiavelli said, if there's a choice between fear and love, you should always pick fear as a ruler because fear is more effective. It gets things done. So if you just want to get things done, fear's your way. Love is more complicated, right? Because people will try to take advantage. What I think Khafre is trying to say here is that good rulership is a blend of the two. A good rulership is I will try to be as nice to you and try to be as benevolent and helpful and good to you as I can, but there's got to be rules. If there's no rules, there's anarchy. I think about this a lot as a professor, where in my opinion, I'm a very nice person. I will try to be as helpful as possible, but there's a line. There's rules that I have for my classroom and the syllabus and the policies and to be fair to everybody in my class, I have to, sort of put my foot down if you want to break a rule. It's like, well, there's rules because I want to be fair to everybody. I don't want to just be an ogre, but, I have to have some standards or there would be anarchy in no sense of what you have to do at all. Well, then why is anyone doing anything in this class, right? If you can turn things in whenever you want and do whatever you want. So I think what Khafre is trying to say here is that good rulership is sort of a blend of these two things, that you have to have the ability to be benevolent and good, but you also have to be able to put your foot down if necessary and use the fist, right, to your sense of advantage. Behind his head, you'll note Horus. So you remember Horus, the falcon god. I mentioned that he protects the pharaoh in life. So I think Horus is here as a sense, sort of saying there's a transition happening, that he's helping Khafre transition into the land of the dead, where his father Osiris will take over as protector. So I think the Horus imagery is very interesting as well. Now I mentioned the canon of proportions. Note one N, not two. A canon is a rule, and the Egyptians used the canon of proportions throughout their entire history of art making. So 3,000 years of art making, they use the canon. And what it is a grid system, you'll notice. It is a set of rules that you use to show a body. This is why Egyptian art always looks the same over and over and over again. It never deviates. Again, 3,000 years. Try to conceive of that, of art looking exactly the same. It's because artists were given this set of rules and you did not deviate from it. So I'd mentioned before in the class that, back at this time period, I don't think artists really thought of themselves as creative, maybe. They were trained, they had a job, they know how to do that job. But again, creativity probably wasn't very high on the list of things that an artist needed at this time because note they had a set of rules. They had to follow them. So, and again, this is why Egyptian art looks the same over and over and over again. You can look at something from the New Kingdom, like you're seeing here, or go back and look at Khafre's Ka statue again. Note it can be applied to statuary, it can be applied to carvings, paintings, pretty much everything. And again, we think it was a way of showing a very strict adherence to a style. So I always use the word stylization with Egyptians because they weren't interested in naturalism. The body doesn't work this way, right? I mean, this is a body like acting like a Rubik's cube. And why we think they did this is there was this belief that they should always show the best part of the body at all times. So if they're showing the body and they want to show you the torso, they show it facing towards you. But if they want to show somebody walking, they show the legs from the side. So you get this interesting kind of use of the body, again, almost like a Rubik's Cube, kind of shifting things into place that aren't supposed to be like that. Try facing your torso forward while having your legs moving sideways. You will be like, I can do it, but ow, I gotta stop doing this, right? I have a bad back. I'm definitely like, nope, I'm not allowed to twist, right? Twist or bend. I'm not allowed to do these things or pick up heavy objects. So your body would revolt. It would say, nope, this is not how the body works, right? So again, why we think they had this sort of stylization is they wanted to have a set of rules that all artists followed, but they also wanted to show you the best view of the body at all times. So 3,000 years, it always looks the same, which leads us to the last piece I wanted to talk about in the Old Kingdom, which is Menkaure and his wife. This is what we have left that represents Menkaure, and it's not a Ka statue. We think it actually was meant to be sort of like a billboard, almost like the Stele of Hammurabi, like it would be in the center of a town and people could see it. So, what do we think it represented about the pharaoh? This came towards the end of the Old Kingdom, as I mentioned, and we know from historical sources that the Old Kingdom was heading towards a decline. He has the smallest pyramid, and we also know that this time was leading into a famine. So he probably couldn't feed the people as well. They were starting to get antsy. So we think that maybe this piece was about like stick with me in unity. Notice he's with his wife and they're together. She's holding him, right? If you think about the fist in the palm, so he has fists and she has palms. So this idea of perhaps the masculine and the feminine as a way of representing leaderships, perhaps that the feminine is benevolent and good and the masculine is more authoritarian. We're reading this in a very simplistic kind of way, but again, these were people who probably wanted simplistic messages. And these are illiterate people that you had to communicate with through visuals. So we had to kind of break this down. What was Menkaure trying to say? I think he was probably like, stay with me through unity. Together we can have prosperity. Let's walk this road together, perhaps. But it is unusual. The wives in Egypt, you never usually saw them. Women were very much part of the private realm of life, and men were part of the public realm of life. It didn't mean women at this time didn't have any rights. We actually know that women did inherit property from their husbands if their husbands died. So women had, some rights, but they were viewed in a very private kind of way. They were in the home with the children. The men were the workers. There was a very specific gender separation that we know of that Egyptians followed. Again, it's unusual to see a woman here. And she shares his hierarchy of scale. Often I'll have students be like, well, she's slightly smaller. And I'm like, yeah, let's not get into the weeds here. Having a woman standing with him, basically the same height, it is significant to note. I will note though that her feet are a little bit behind him. Like she still knew to walk a little bit behind. And often people will bring up like, oh, she looks so strikingly like him. I'm like, well, think about it for a minute. This is probably his sister, right? So yeah, they look alike. And if you think about the canon of proportions, once again, we get these very rigid, stylized bodies, and we have these bodies that are shown to be very perfect. So I always look at Khafre and Menkaure and I see this perfection of their form, perhaps as another way of trying to communicate like prosperity. Another reading, the last reading I'll mention, is some people view this statue as kind of an updated Osiris and Isis kind of thing. Like maybe they're trying to invoke the gods and the relationship between Osiris and Isis and that sense of partnership. And again, I think it's an interesting one to note as well. But what we find here at the end of the Old Kingdom, again, as I mentioned, is sort of a slide towards famine. An intermediate period will occur, and that will lead us into our discussion of the Middle Kingdom.